Let's find our next inhale. And then exhale. Just slowly opening the eyes when you're ready. Hello, Brad.
That was awesome.
Oh,
That was great. That was great. But I don't know if people think of, well, it's easy to overlook meditating throughout the day. We're busy. We're always someplace. We're looking forward to having that meal. We're eager to watch a video online, laugh, be entertained. We have something to prepare for work and as the day goes on. So, it's obvious the value to start your day with such a thing. And that's why, I always try to do something meditative to start my day. But what I'm noticing here is, it's just past 7 p.m. local time. And so the idea of a meditation in the evening when the day is mostly gone, past, we've experienced what today brought, the ups and the downs, the chores, the whatever. It's a Saturday. Maybe we did some errands. And I like to re-engage with the richness of what each hour of the day can bring, whether it's 7 a.m. or 7 p.m. So that's a powerful reminder, not to mention the specifics of the meditation, which I found unique and moving. I felt like when you asked about expanding the chest and then letting it retract, I thought, hey, that's like energy giving me a hug.
Oh, I love that.
That's like the air and the life energy, the field around me. It's giving me a hug and it's squeezing me as I'm exhaling. So the idea of hug and embrace came to mind and came to heart.
Oh, thanks for sharing that. That's beautiful.
Great stuff.
Well, I love that. Yeah, I actually have never thought about that when I've breathed it into my sides, and that's actually such a beautiful way of holding it. So,
yeah, and the stability of I never ever heard that sentence in my life. Breathe into your hips.
Wow.
That sentence, I've never heard those words in English language or any language put together like that. The concept is altogether new. So I guess my experience with meditation has been fairly standard. So like the idea of breathing in your belly as opposed to your chest, or intentionally breathing with your rib cage, like you suggested. The idea of sitting tall or standing tall, depending on the, however your posture is, that I've heard. But yeah, the hip thing was totally unique too. So
yeah, it shows the power of our intention that the mind-body connection is really real, and we can actually direct energy to different parts of our body with intention. I could say so much more about how the CIA knew this and did extensive studies about this, but I'm working on a newsletter about that right now.
Well, why I was eager to talk to you, I find you so unique because I was looking at your website before we hopped on this call, and I know people who are, they want to know the truth, right? They're Mulder and Scully, right? X-Files. They want to know what's out there, what's really going on, whether it's extraterrestrial or whether it's just what's really going on with our tax dollars. What's the real deal in Ukraine? What's the real deal with, to get dark right away here, the Epstein files? What is really going on? But the people I know that dig into that stuff, what really happened at the Las Vegas mass shooting, at that concert, right? But those people tend to be cynical and with good reason, right? Because you dig into some of this stuff and at the very least, you realize it doesn't align with the usual explanation. And it doesn't mean the worst. It doesn't mean the darkest, but it at least means something unsettling. That the passively accepted idea or narrative of explanations of these events or, situations that we're in are not accurate. And there's an urge to get the truth out there. And so there's an urgency. And then if there is a conspiracy, which we all know there have been, then that just, to me, that inspires some, distrust at least. Some, it might shake your foundation. Like if you're patriotic and you've always said the Pledge of Allegiance and you've always felt, this is a good country, or whatever truth that you hold dear, whether it's a patriotic thing or a religious thing. And then you learn these, that, behind the standard explanation is something else. It can be like the rug being pulled out from underneath you. And so it's at least that. And then if you believe it's sinister motives, like, well, why then are we told something that's not 100% true? Like, is there a cover up? Is there corruption? Are there evil people that are just, that are able to lie with a straight face and, maintain a false narrative and not break a sweat? Are they that cold? Are they that sociopathic? And are the truths they're covering that horrible? Like, whether it's trafficking or assassinations, or, we're talking about murder here, we're talking about people's lives. And so it gets really dark really fast. And so I think a lot of people, when they do dig into this stuff, they become cynical. They become, screw it all. Like, it's all a lie. Like, I'm never going to stand at a baseball game again and sing the Star Spangled Banner. Like, it's over. I'm done. I don't even want to pay taxes, and then they might. So it tends to go off into a negative way. But so this is where you come in, and I see you as being different. Your website is about positivity. You talked about Ikigai right away at the top of your site, and, finding your passion, finding your purpose. And the people that I know that are really into that, right? Like, seek positivity, seek love, seek unity, seek oneness. They're not that conspiratorial, right? Because they're just not that interested. It's just like, look, I don't know, right? Yeah. I don't know. And you know what? In a way, I don't want to know, because that is drama that I'll never be able to fully know, first off, because I wasn't there. And I'm not in these rooms that these powerful people are discussing these plans. I wasn't at this event in Las Vegas or when JFK was killed. Like, I there's no way I'll ever 100% know. So why? And why learn the details of dark truths if that's going to pollute my desire and progress in helping people find their love, their center, and to bring many people together. So it seems counterproductive, I think, for a lot of folks who want to stress unity and love. And yet you are unique, because it seems that you do both. You do want to know the truth. You work for a website called WantToKnow.info, and it's all about, like, okay, here's the real deal here. Like, this is what's really going on with this foreign policy, or with this scandal, or whatever, or with this cover up. And yet so I guess my first question after all of this setup is, do you take the truths that you discover as like, well, boy, things really are messed up behind the curtain. I guess that's all the more reason why we need to really work on ourselves, and why I need to at least work on myself. This is you talking, to be strong, to be positive, because boy, it really is ugly out there. And a lot of people are getting the wool pulled over their eyes. I want to spread the truth, but I don't want to make people withdraw and be negative. So I have to come at this with a super positive approach, so that people can receive the truth with comfort, even though the truth might be unsettling. Something like that. Is it kind of a balance act for you? Yeah, maybe just talk about that on that topic, because both things seem, to negatively correlate with each other. Like, the more conspiracies you learn, the less likely you're going to be to want to be, unifying with the world and humanity. You might become cynical and bitter about humanity, looking at the dark side of it, but you don't seem to do that.
Yeah, I mean, thanks for sharing all that. Maybe it might be helpful to start off with a defining moment when I was 10 years old as to why I even found myself in this position, being a director of a nonprofit information service, WantToKnow.info, which was founded by a high-level State Department whistleblower. So we've been around since 2003. So I'll get to that in just a moment. So I'm 10 years old and I'm watching a mini documentary on humanitarian aid workers. And I find myself falling to my knees crying because I felt so touched by what I saw as the purest expressions of human goodness. This sense of people that are meeting the world's rage and suffering with compassion and love and service to something greater than themselves. And I didn't have the words back then, but that was ultimately what I experienced when I was 10. And I thought, that's what I want to do. I don't want to do anything else. And in fact, my 5th grade career project, I denied all of the things that came up on the quiz we were supposed to take of the 5 careers that would best suit my personality. And I did a whole thing on humanitarian aid workers and I failed because that's a volunteer job. So I've always been driven by this sense of human goodness. And that's...
You failed the assignment?
Yeah, because it wasn't a real career. It's like a job. It's like they're like, well, it's a volunteer job, It's more of kind of a thing you do just to help out, but it's not like a career you can build on. Yeah, so anyways, I just knew that I would commit my life to doing that. That somehow this sense of human goodness and seeing human courage as well was what saved me even in my childhood. And there was a lot of fear and there was a lot of suffering in my childhood with my parents. And opening up to the greater good and what's possible was, and seeing that everywhere I went was how I coped with my childhood. But then as I got older, I just kept wondering, why does so much suffering exist in such a beautiful world, a beautiful planet that provides literally everything we need? Why is there so much suffering? Why is there violence? And it reminds me of Harriet Tubman, who helped free countless slaves. She once said, if we wish to be free, we must understand the ways in which we're not. So the older I got, I realized that I needed to follow the truth wherever it led, even into the darkest corners of our collective story. And so I began to take on work with different organizations and different efforts to help me understand what's really driving the suffering. And so one major thing I've learned is the media. I realized that it's really so much of our suffering and our ability to understand suffering is based on what the media does or doesn't tell us. So I began working with Project Censored, where we look at media literacy. We look at the difference between corporate media and independent media. And we talk about news that doesn't make the news. So things that are censored, things that are covered up. And we do research and we publish it into a book annually. So I was starting to do that. And then at the time I was working at a high school, running a wellness center and doing restorative justice work, which I was bringing kids together from in and out of juvenile hall. I was bringing police officers and students and activists together, and I was trying to help mediate a lot of the conflicts on campus and supported some of the most at-risk, marginalized youth. But the more I looked around and I saw what was happening in the world, and then COVID changed so many things, that I realized that I was deep in the social justice world. And the social justice narratives that were mainly about race and gender wasn't satisfying me to really understand the suffering in our world. And so, yes, I was talking about policing corruption. And then, yes, I was talking about equity issues and the lived experiences of people of color versus non-people of color, and thinking this was it. This is me understanding the world. And The more I looked, though, I realized I wasn't really getting the answers I needed, because you could have all the people of color you want at high levels of power, and you're still seeing the same corruption. This is true on a local level too, with our institutions and our schools. So I knew I needed to step outside of that. And so I started going to MAGA rallies. I started going to vaccine safety conferences. I started talking to people from all ends of the spectrum, people that weren't even partisan. And I started seeing the seeds of truth wherever I went. And that empowered me to be able to open up to different perspectives, which I realized in the social justice world, I was missing some of that. It felt like there was this polarization and what I call the era of cancel culture, where it's just so easy to dehumanize and cut people out and label people because they think differently than you. But ultimately, what I realized is that when I got out of my singular viewpoint and when I moved beyond the social justice narratives, I still see myself as a social justice activist. But when I moved beyond the race and gender narratives, it's funny because we're often told we'll be indulging in hateful ideologies or misinformation, but I found the exact opposite was true. I found incredible nuance and complexity wherever I went. And I witnessed change and healing and transformation in places I never thought possible.
You thought, I'm sorry, you were told that if you went to some of these other groups, you would encounter hate?
Yeah. And I think this
Okay.
is a larger reflection of our media, right? Like it's like challenge vaccines, all of a sudden you're, right-wing Trump supporter.
Yeah.
Along with many other issues where complex issues that aren't really partisan get boxed into partisan labels. And when complex issues get reduced to, oh, that's a right wing or a left wing talking point. So that's like one of the first ways I spot propaganda is when things get boxed into partisan labels and frameworks, when issues are much more complex than that. So when I took on this role as director of WantToKnow.info, I was really searching for a narrative that could help me make sense of things, but also what could really bring us all together. It just seems like our differences are so big. How are we going to talk to each other? And so just a little bit to backtrack about Want to Know. So you talked a lot about what we do. We uncover the hidden forces shaping history and driving global events today, regardless of who's elected into office. But we also weave together these darker truths with the very ideas, movements, and people that are working to transform those very systems. So it's very much both and, that we look at the darkness in order to heal it, because we can't shift the chaos we're in until we name it clearly. And so Fred Burks was our founder back in 2003. He was a high-level State Department whistleblower who interpreted for presidents like Bush and Clinton, and he even interpreted for Al Gore, Indonesian officials as well, and ended up blowing the whistle on various government crimes, and really wanted to educate the public about what really happens at the highest levels of power, because he was in those. He flew in black military helicopters. He was in these top secret meetings and said, wow, what people get through the media is very different than what actually happens behind closed doors. And so after years of dedicating my life to media studies, public education, social justice activism, nothing could have prepared me for the darkness I faced when I took on WantToKnow.info. And if anyone watching this can look at our website and see the depth and willingness to face some of the darkest corners of the society, that I had to walk through the fire of disillusionment about everything I knew about how the world worked. I mean, I was a very idealistic, happy person. I loved, like, I feel like over the years, my idealism about the world shattered into something greater, though, into something that actually has helped me be a more grounded person, in which my love for humanity is actually stronger and more real than ever was before. But how did I do that? Because I had to learn how to trust human goodness again. And like in the midst of so much noise, this is really important too. With all the noise, like, how do we know what's real? How do we know it's trustworthy? Because you go down the rabbit hole and it's really easy to get lost and actually have that change and warp your sense of reality. So we like to call it at Want to Know, we call it conscious rabbit holing. How do we consciously go down the rabbit hole and never lose sight of our values, but also always question, right? Always question any narrative. But to your question, I had to go back to that 10-year-old Amber and remind myself of what I'm here to do, that my activism felt most empowered and effective when I was focused on what I was for, not just what I was against. And that's, I think, a challenge activism faces is it's all about opposition and resisting what's wrong, which is important. But it's very little, but there's hardly any vision. And that's kind of why I left the Democratic Party and became independent, is because it just felt like there was no vision anymore. It was just, we're all against Trump and it's all about getting Trump out of office. But all these complex issues we're facing started way before he came into view, right? So I once heard this that stopped me in my tracks. And I always like to say this when I think about my journey. To create the world you want, you must know yourself beyond the distress of oppression and fear. To create the world you want, you must know yourself beyond the distress of oppression and fear. That what transforms a divided world, with all the research I've done, all the activism I've done, what transforms a divided world isn't just the same old talking points or the same old negative news. It's really the relationships that break the cycle of fear and separation and dehumanization. And that's what I feel like I've committed my life to, is being a social healer, bringing people together. And with my restorative justice work, I brought that into my world as well, that I've brought together, gosh, I've like hundreds of people and had dialogue where people were brought into the room that you never think would be in the same room together. And I've literally witnessed miraculous moments of healing and understanding. And so I've learned that it's not our differences that divide us, it's the judgment about our differences. And so my work right now is dedicated to the tools, the practices, and the ideas, and the important education so that we can begin doing that in our own lives.
It seems that the foundation for your activism, your investigative work, your whistleblowing, or your uncovering of truths, that the foundation for all of that is truly to help.
Yeah.
The way you saw those humanitarian workers help. And that's a very pure, like, there's a hurricane, let's get some supplies into this community. And I think that really, I've seen a lot of activists too. And I did the documentary about people who are homeless and these encampments. And there was a big difference between activists who are there out of a desire to defend the rights of the homeless. Like that's what is on their, that's at the forefront of their, and that's not a bad thing. Defend the rights of people. Like, that's a good thing. But it was this defensive fight, right? So like, I remember coming around and I would interview a lot of these individuals living there. And I remember being approached a couple of times by individuals there doing this defense work, or whatever you want to call it, this sort of activism for these encampments. And they're coming up to me aggressively, like, what are you doing? Why are you talking to, why do you have a camera? Why are you recording them? And they thought they were helping the people there. And I said, because I'm getting their stories and they want me to capture their story, to get it out there, right? And I remember like getting upset with one guy, and he later would apologize. He was a decent person, but that initial, and I could just see the fear in his eyes, like it was all fight or flight, and it was fight for him. And I think a lot of activism is that it's about trying to respond to a threat, which again is normal and good and healthy. But if that's all you're doing, then it's just fight, and there's no healing really. And I think we're seeing that play out on the streets of some of these cities that are stricken with a lot of individuals who are using very toxic substances, and they languish, right? Because, their rights are defended. They're able to stay outside and use very dangerous substances, but they're not being helped, right? They're being defended to do that to themselves, but they're not being really helped. Now that opposes the other kind of activists or volunteers that you would see at encampments, and they were there truly to help. Like they would come there, and like there was one old couple who, in the dead of winter, I mean, it's Minnesota, and that's what intrigued me. I came at it from a real intrigue. It was the dead of winter, and I saw this encampment, and I was like, wow, they're gonna make it all winter in this weather. Like,
Yeah.
if you haven't experienced an upper Midwest winter, it's serious. Like people freeze to death every year. Like it's lethal. And yet they would go out there and they had a sled. They'd take a sled and they'd put all the supplies on there, always some hot meals and some thermal, some coolers, and they'd slide behind this old man and woman, and they just, you can't really knock on a tent door, but they might tap it and ask if that person's in there. And by now they'd gotten to know them, so they're like, "Oh, Jim or Trish or whatever their name was, are you there?" And they might say from inside the tent, "Yeah, okay, we have some meals here. Would you like some?" And I remember interviewing them and being like, "Why are you doing this ultimately?" And he's like, "Hey, everyone needs nourishment. Everyone needs a good meal, and that's all there is to it." Like they were very religious, and it really did seem to be inspired by the teachings of and actions of Jesus. To help the lowest among you, and those who obviously are in most need should be the ones who get the most attention. And even though this is maybe a dangerous place, they felt protected and they knew their hearts were in the right place in it. And they weren't there to ever like, what are you doing here? Suspicion, right? There was suspicion on the activists, but these volunteers, they were just there to love. And it seems like with your story, it starts with love. It starts with, I want to be a humanitarian. And then recognizing that, well, gosh, if I really want to be a humanitarian and help people who are victims, like let's say trafficking victims or something like that, then why don't we uncover what's really going on? Like what's going on at the border? What's going on with these missing adolescents in this a community or whatever? What's really happening here? And so this is where you can start to look into the darker side of things, learning the truth. And but then again, I just love how you don't get, how you say your viewpoint of humanity was shattered, and yet it was shattered in a way that I guess maybe broadened your base of love. Like when you learn about really corrupt people, evil people, or at least people that are doing extremely evil things, do you still find it in your heart to like not hate them?
Well, the first step before we even focus on anyone, just to continue what you're sharing, is I guess a big part of what I went through is the willingness to feel the pain. And I think as activists, as you said, the fight or flight, there's this culture of nervous system dysregulation where we get stressed and we don't know how to cope with our stress. We don't know how to cope with our judgments. And instead of feeling them and facing them and working with them, we project out. And so in many ways, activism, like we need to break the illusion about what's going on and resist what's wrong and be oppositional, but it comes at a cost if that's the only orientation that we're coming from. And so part of how we learn to open up to human goodness and what's possible, which I think is the next stage of activism, is relationships. It's the relational world of building relationships across differences and opening up to what's possible. So not just staying on problems and what's wrong, because when we do that, we know we're creating our own reality. Every thought, every intention creates our reality. So if we're only focusing on what's making us afraid or angry, we're going to create more of that. It's like Julia Butterfly Hill. She lived in a redwood tree for over 700 days to prevent the logging of the forest. And she said, in her book, she said, when I climbed the redwood trees, I realized it had nothing to do with the fact that I was angry at the corporations and the government. When I climbed the trees, she's like, what I realized, it was really my love for humanity and my connection to the natural world that drove my activism. And so if we keep focusing on what we don't want and what we're against, we're just going to create more of that energy. So how do we open up to that? And, a big part for me is how do we really face the darkness? And so one of the things that I'm really passionate about now is how do we bring in the level, how do we bring in the nervous system regulation into activism and how we engage with the media? Because if our emotions are getting hijacked all the time and we're constantly producing negative experiences, negative emotions in our bodies, which we know is directly related to inflammation and stress and tension in our body, we need to notice that our own tension and resistance adds to the problem. So we have to feel what's going on. And so partly when I think about anger, we know, because I used to teach stress management skills, anger is a secondary emotion. So there's always something underneath the anger. What is that? And when you tune into that, it becomes less about other people and what they're doing and more about how you're making sense of the own emotions and feelings moving through you. So I had to grieve. I had to let go of my certainty about what I thought about the world. And it's really hard to do that. And I've had friends tell me, like, I'm sure what you're looking at is there's some real things to it, but I just can't go there. So how do we go there? And that's kind of been what I've been focusing on. But then to your other point, I was going to say something to your other point. Something about, well, you know what? I forgot where I was going with. I forgot the part that I wanted to share, but something that came up for me now is that I had to, when I was working in the high school, I was doing a lot of de-escalation. I was trained in de-escalation. How do you humanely de-escalate or even restrain children who are at risk to themselves or other people and do it in a way that supports their dignity? So I've been in very tense situations, breaking up fights, and this is not just with children, with adults too. And what I've learned is that, as I said earlier, our own resistance and tension adds to the problem. And so when we show up as calm, and that often means not really talking much, and listening and being a calm, grounded, regulated presence, it literally changes the energy in the room and the people in the room. So what I love to say is that each of us, no matter what we believe in, right? Like, does that actually is very irrelevant to this, that each of us can become what I call a regulating presence. People whose very energy helps regulate the hijacked nervous system of the collective. Because there's so much stress, there's so much fear, and we're inundated with that all the time through our media. And that this openness has a ripple effect. So it can change how we listen, how we speak, how others feel in our presence. And when we bring this into our relationships and in our activism, we can actually become the kind of person whose grounded energy helps people relax. And when we relax, we tend to think in new, open ways. We become more curious. We open to goodness. We actually see the goodness that's always here. And we can imagine new possibilities. So if we're afraid, fear narrows, right? And we evolved to be fearful. We needed it, or else literally humans would not survive. The nervous system has been evolving for millions of years, but it was always meant for dangerous situations. And now we're in this chronic state of fear. This isn't healthy for us. And so it literally shuts down our prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for empathy and decision-making, problem-solving, critical thinking. So this is why this is so important. And I really believe that this is a big part of anyone, no matter who you are, no matter what you believe in, we can all practice this. And I think once we do that, we can create the conditions for better dialogue with each other. And as Jacques Ellul said, he's a social scientist, propaganda ends where simple dialogue begins. How do we bring back the skills and the collective capacity for us to have conversations across our differences?
It sounds like in order to be an effective activist, advocate, if you want to dig into deeper realms of activism, and by that I mean like uncovering some dark stuff out there that you want to improve or counteract, shed some light on, then it's required of the activist to do so responsibly. The activist must match that darkness out there with self-improvement, with growth inside. Is, work on your light to match the darkness that you're about to.
Take responsibility for our emotions, because if we don't take care of our emotions, we add more tension,
Yeah.
we add more stress.
And the more intense the situation, the more potential for stress. So that requires the activist to strengthen themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So if you kind of match the darkness with your light, and the darker you go, the brighter you have to be. Like, my gosh, it sounds to me like it's like a lifetime of healthy activism would be one in which you shine brighter and brighter and brighter, because the deeper down the cave of human evil you're going. And because if you're going to let that darkness snuff out your light, you're better off not being there, because you're going to add to the darkness. You're going to add to the tension. You're going to, that kind of thing.
Right. Well, I'm
just conceiving kind of the framework, the dynamic in play here for the healthy activist. And it's a very demanding life beyond what I'd considered even before this conversation. Like, you're helping me be really aware of this concept, and I bet there's a lot of angry activists out. I've seen them.
Yeah. Well, and something that I've learned too, I have a whole background in nonviolent activism, which draws upon the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. and Mahatma Gandhi, that if we address problems with the shaming, the blaming, the dehumanizing, the othering, the my way or the highway, which defines a lot of activism, and on all sides, right? Like, whether you're right wing, left wing, independent, alternative, like whatever, that if you are coming from a lens of my way or the highway, I know what's right, and if you're coming from enemy making, us versus them, which is very common now, right? Like, we're told to look at this current administration and what they're doing, but, look closely. A lot of this division is within our own communities and online.
It's to the point now where the word activist is a pejorative. Like, remember, did you ever watch Ace Ventura?
God, a long time ago.
The second Ace Ventura, he goes to this ball, of course, and everyone's dressed fancy. And he, of course, he's dressed ridiculous, as Ace Ventura dresses. And then this little guy in a tuxedo comes down these steps, of course, this beautiful staircase, with this tall, elegantly dressed woman, and she has a fur on. And Ace Ventura, he's a pet detective. He loves animals. And so he sees this shawl, or this, whatever you call it, around her neck. And he's like, that's a lovely something of death you have on there. He says some sarcastic comment. And then she says to the little guy in a tuxedo, or maybe the little guy says to her, I don't know. But one of them say, oh, another activist. And then they sort of chuckle to themselves in this rich way, an activist, all right? So the word so I even kind of hesitate to say that. I sometimes will say the word advocate instead of activist, because activist has gotten such a bad name over the years.
Yeah.
Because it's seen as these urgent, desperate, tight.
And we know the history of activism is a pretty challenging one. I mean, COINTELPRO was a great example where activists broke into the FBI office. Was it the 80s, 70s, 80s? I think it was 80s. And they discovered all of these tactics to infiltrate activism and create radical elements within activism to make activism become less effective. And so Loretta Ross, she's an incredible civil rights activist who lived through COINTELPRO, looks at how the current activism is on the left now, and is really calling attention to this call-out culture where, as I said earlier, it's easy to dehumanize. And then also the focus isn't about unifying, it's about destabilizing. And she said one time, she was being interviewed in an article for The Intercept about how progressive organizations all over this country are at a standstill because everyone's fighting over gender and racial dynamics. And then everyone's like walking on eggshells with each other, afraid to say the wrong thing. And so she said, if you're more wedded to destabilizing than unifying, I'm either going to think you're naive or that you're a plant, just like the FBI. She's like, neither one of those is going to look good on you. And so that's such an important topic for me, because this is what I forgot I was going to say, back to the enemy making, that activism, especially what I started seeing in the social justice world, and I know I'm not alone in this. I'll get to that in just a moment, where there's this like tactic of shame, blame, and enemy making. And what Martin Luther King Jr., why he was really trying to create a nonviolent revolution, is because he realized that if we use those tactics, we're literally recreating the systems of domination we're trying to heal from. And so Bell Hooks is another amazing civil rights activist who said that without an ethic of love, shaping the direction of our political aspirations, we are seduced into continued allegiance to systems of domination. So much of what she was saying is like, what I've seen in the progressive left and just progressive organizations in general is this militant lack of love and this focus on material goals, right? Like law, policy changes, but very little focus on the quality of our relationships with each other. And so this is kind of what I think is the next stage of activism, is where we actually start talking to each other and we build these cross-cultural, cross-political connections. And so I say this because it's really easy for any of us, like activists, to think we know what's going on in the world. But how can we really know what's going on in the world when so much of our dialogue has been manipulated by special interests? And a classic example that I really value bringing up is this idea that the majority of Americans are self-censoring. Study after study, poll after poll online shows that most people are actually afraid to share their views. They're afraid to get canceled, but also they're afraid to like have their careers ruined. So scientists and doctors in the gender medicine world for children like are like talking, saying, I've never felt such a culture of censorship in the field of science, where open inquiry, right, and looking at different perspectives is literally the spirit of science, and we're actually afraid to like say the wrong thing, and that's what's motivating us versus a genuine inquiry. And so also a recent study, what was it, last year, and it studied, like it had a public poll and it also looked at millions of social media posts, and what it found is that there's been an unprecedented decline in our country to share unique or controversial views, because we're like, there's this fear that if I say something and it's going to be taken the wrong way, or I'm going to be called a racist or a transphobe or right-wing MAGA, all these labels serve to make us so afraid to share our authentic voice. And so if we're not even able as a society for people to feel safe to share their views, how much do we really know about what people think in this world? And so the media does a really good job of presenting what I call the illusion of consensus, where it's like, okay, no, there's a clear this side and then this side, and they're fighting each other. When you talk to most people are much more nuanced when you really start talking. And so this culture of fear that's literally silencing, we're silencing ourselves. And I've had circles with social justice activists saying, you know what? That moment in the classroom, I didn't think that was racist. And then crickets, right? But then afterwards, everyone's like, I agree with you. So it's like, wow, isn't this interesting? We're creating this culture. So I think that, especially if we're talking about kind of the left activists and the social justice activists, we need to get really honest about what's really motivating us. And there's so much fear, and there's so much cancellation. There's so much treating people like disposable artifacts. Like, you think like that? And so what I've come to find is that one of the greatest challenges in our society right now that I think activism is fueling is the loss of community, the loss of social capital, right? Social capital is the value, trust, and support we create with each other. And so third places, that's like the places beyond work and home, they've been on the decline. Uptown, right? Like Uptown used to be a thriving social area, and now it's like most of the places are boarded up, and that's the case for many places across the country. Loneliness is on the rise. Literally, Japan and the UK have a minister for loneliness to try to address this. So I love this book called The Soul of Civility by Alexandra Hudson, and she says that as physical gathering places and friendships and community and family have all been on the decline, more and more people have found their ultimate meaning in political issues. And so now it's really easy to feel that your very identity is being assaulted because someone thinks differently than you. And so if we're constantly in this fight or flight mode, right, where we like take one aspect of, I was like, oh, okay, that person is challenging gender medicine for youth. Oh, there must be a transphobe Trump supporter, right? And so we take one aspect of who a person is and we think we know this person, but we don't. And through dialogue, we'll realize things are much more complex and actually that we have more in common than we think. And this is time and time again, studies have come out, and also we have a news category called Healing Our Relationships, where we show countless examples of people coming together across their differences and realizing they have more in common than they think, and that the division is an illusion, and that our own unwillingness to see each other as fellow humans is one of the greatest risks to our democracy if we're trying to protect that democracy. And so these are so like, I don't think anyone has the answers. We're living in, there's an acronym called VUCA. We're living in a VUCA world: volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous. We don't know where we're going. Our economy is looking confusing and scary. And there's so many things happening, and we feel what many people call the meta crisis, right? Which is this kind of integration of the poly crisis, the different crises, whether it's environmental, economic, social, political, energy crisis. Like, we've got these mounting crises. What do we do? And most of us, we don't know what to do. But the one thing we can do is we can heal our stress, which impairs how we think, because we need grounded energy now. We need to show up as empowered and healthy and clear as we can. And we also need each other. We need to rebuild social capital. There's a public health study by, I think, Felton Earls. He's a Harvard public health professor that studied neighborhoods and communities across Chicago and wanted to know what was the top factor for health. Like, what was the top factor to a community that did well and was successful and was able to like mobilize? And you would think it's like access to healthcare, low crime levels, wealth. But what he actually found was that the top factor was what he called collective efficacy, which is the capacity of people to come together in common interest, in common ground, to come together. And so that can't happen if we are dehumanizing and abstracting other people based on labels, based on engineered media narratives designed to hijack our emotions and manipulate our opinions. So this is also what I study, is the media landscape. But on a deeper, bigger, but then I think some depth is needed. Like Loretta Ross, I mentioned her earlier. She was asked one time, what do you think is the biggest loss to our society when we fall into cancel culture, where we just dehumanize and cut people out? And she said the greatest loss first is depth. In this, really fast-paced life, we want simple answers. We want something we can hold on to. And the idea that, things may not be as simple as we think it is, because we're such a fast-paced life right now, and to slow things down, which is what's required of us to understand what's going on, is hard. And so I think what we really need right now is depth. And I've got two things that speak to that depth, but I'll just pause right here. But it kind of goes back to this question you brought up with about, like, how do we really face the darkness? And so I've got two things to speak to that, but I'll pause here.
And I'm glad you have that in mind, because I struggle facing the darkness, right? Like, I will learn a story that is so dark, or I'll perceive a truth that is so dark that cynic rises in me. And I don't want to stew and focus on people I don't like or a movement I don't like or whatever. So I'll just kind of check out. I'll just be like, well, boy, I'm not even going to touch that because I don't want to get angry, that kind of thing. And I don't think that's ultimately the best answer either. I think being at least conscious and proactive is ideal to the degree that one can contribute something positive. And so I want to hear about that so I can learn these things without, growing cynical or bitter. So I'm eager to hear that. But first, to reply to some of the things you just said, what's the volatile, uncertain, complex, and what's the fourth one?
Ambiguous.
Ambiguous, yeah. Okay.
So this actually came from military research.
Okay.
Forgot a lot of like the deeper history of it, but it actually came from military research looking at the world. And so we need to prepare ourselves in a VUCA world. And then so it got popularized in many different ways.
Okay. Thanks for that. That's awesome. I have long recognized a lot of these adjectives, but I hadn't heard it in that acronym before. So that's great conceptualization for me and anyone. The other thing was, this is a topic that I love in general, and that's the role of the internet. What the internet has done, and I compare it to what the printing press did, right? I mean, ultimately, the printing press helped enable the Reformation, which helped end the monopoly of the Catholic Church's rule over Europe. All right. And then from there, we got Protestantism, and then suddenly the northern parts of Europe were Lutherans or eventually Anglicans, and there were Calvinists, and, then we got all the denominations that spread across the country and the world, whether it's Jehovah's Witnesses to Mormons to Baptists to Amish, right? The Anabaptists. But that ability to, and we look for like the 95 Theses. We look for the moments that are famous for being like seminal moments that changed the world. But really, it was death by 1,000 paper cuts or the straw that broke the camel's back. Like, it was a lot of little things, and it was the people's ability to read the Bible themselves. Now they have a Bible and they're literate, and then they can interpret for themselves rather than having the priest tell them what's in it. They read it themselves, and then they start interpreting it, and they came up with all kinds of, some of the ideas were pretty wacky, but in the end, we ended up getting Protestantism and all these different kinds of Christian ways of worship. Now today, we've got the internet. And some people take that and go down rabbit holes, and they become quite radical in all kinds of ways, right? But my interest in that topic, where it applies to this conversation, and maybe a question for you is, if I've connected these dots adequately, do you see how the rise of or the presence of this technology we have that connects everyone 24/7 just makes unity that much harder, at least for such a large entity, a large jurisdiction? When you said people are self-censoring, they can't talk about these things, the first thing I thought of was, well, actually you can, and I hear them every Thanksgiving. Now, families tend to believe similar things, but there's still variability. And while I have some family that likes Trump, I have some family that doesn't like Trump. And they will let some of them are pretty opinionated, and that'll come out. That's not, a 180, but it's one issue on which I see my own family disagreeing on some things. I'm guessing that within families, there is some healthy dialogue, some. And so the point that came to mind for me was that there can be healthy dialogue. It just won't happen on X because it's too big. That's why you have to self-censor on X and maybe on Facebook and social media, because that can go out to the world, and we're afraid of the repercussions of people who will attack us, who will call our place of work and get us fired, or put a bunch of bad Google reviews together, and then suddenly our business has a 1 star. But in the small, and so before the internet, there wasn't this threat of being attacked by 1 million people outside of your community. There was the community. And I'm guessing within the community, and I'm even guessing within, say, like today's communities to a degree, like a school board, and maybe they're discussing, how we should reopen after COVID. And there's probably some healthy disagreement there about how to do that. Now, even a school board isn't always safe from the watchful eye of the internet, because, we've seen some footage from school boards saying things, doing things that attracted the ire of political opponents. And then that school gets calls and emails, and they got to shut down their social media and all of that. So I just wonder if things were distributed, if things were decentralized. You said yourself at the beginning that you had yourself kind of shattered, and then that ended up making you stronger. And Christianity was shattered, but now we've got people worshiping in 100 different ways the same Christian faith or similar Christian faith. And I wonder if the society wasn't more distributed, then it would matter less what Miami does to Minneapolis, or what one county in the state does to the rest of the state. You know what I mean? When you have this big top-down organization, it does matter what this one guy in Alabama thinks about who should be president, because I don't want him to decide who's going to be my president. Does that make sense? So we're threatened by the actions of people across the country, the way people across the country think and feel, because they might choose someone to go to Congress or to go into the White House that is going to be a threat to me. If we didn't have that structure and we kind of just did things independently, I'm not saying to dissolve the US, but the idea is that if you've got these states and the country and the structures as they are, then we are all connected. Let's say at the state level, all right, I am affected by how people on the other side of the state vote because of who ends up in the governor's mansion. And if power was more distributed, if decision-making was more distributed, then it would matter less how they decided to run their lives, because we would run ours this way. And so I guess the big question I have after all of that is, do you think we should or need to restructure, just like the Catholic Church and Christianity was restructured in the wake of the printing press, so that people could worship the way they wished and believe what they wanted, but still under the umbrella of Christianity? Do you think the internet is going to require a restructuring of political, societal organization so that we're not all under the same rigid system and can be more flexible and autonomous with how we want to run our local societies? Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. No, and you said a lot there. There's so many things that I could say to that. But the first thing, I'll just slow things down. And I feel like what we're trying to do, which is really important for us as a society, is it's really easy. It's like you're walking a hike, like you're on a hike, and you turn a corner and all you see is like a big rock and a tree, but then you go up the hill and you see something differently. And so I think what we need to do as a society is not just tune into any one point, but to really expand out and look at the bigger picture and expand our view. And that is number one. So talk about expanding our view is we're literally operating with a system of governance that's been around for a long, long, long time. And our level of existence now is so much more complex. And if you think about humans in general, that, we're arguably a very young species. And so we're still, as a human family, learning how to be a human together, learning how to grow and evolve. Even just 100 years ago, life was so different. So we're literally figuring out, we're building the plane while flying it. And so it makes a lot of sense we'd create a system that can address the level of complexity we live in now. And I think our systems are outdated. I think a lot of the chaos we see right now is a reflection of a system that's dying, and a new system has yet to be born. And so this is a perfect time for us to say, how do we want to harness this moment in time right now versus
Speaking of
it's
chaos, if we did restructure it, holy cow, like that is the monopoly breaking in the Catholic Church led to a lot of bloodshed.
Yeah. And so that's I actually think there's going to be a lot of unrest, but I think that it's always as above, so below. So technology is a perfect example of that, right? It's like you've got on one level, you've got technology that is liberating the human family in ways we never thought possible. As you know very well, the potential of blockchain is pretty powerful. Decentralized technologies that take out the middlemen, for example, but also just like the ways in which we have access to so much information, whereas news used to be much more centralized. And so I love this one. I forgot who said this, but I once heard it's like, yes, there's misinformation. There's all this like potentially false information online, but now we have the option to talk to each other directly. We can share injustices in real time so people can actually see it.
Yeah, we can shine light on all kinds of corners of the country and all kinds of corners.
Yeah, and we can connect people in ways that we never could. And so there's that potential, and yet any any technology can be exploited. And so even with the AI, it's like journalist Keenan Malik, he said, it's not AI that we should be afraid of, it's how it's being used, how it's being deployed. And when you start asking that, then it's not as simple as, oh, you're AI versus against AI, which our media narratives funnel these very simplistic ways of understanding complex emerging issues like technology. But I will say, I don't think we have time to get into it today, but the online world has changed from when it started. And we all know that. But even more specifically than that is that social media and our online communications have been heavily manipulated by special interests. And so one of my areas of focus during COVID was really looking at the extensive network of intelligence agencies, people in government, corporate forces, NGOs that were all working to silence people and create division online. And so we actually have access to these declassified documents and leaked documents by Edward Snowden, who was a defense contractor and ended up exposing all these files showing what the NSA was up to, that they really weren't established for national security. They were established to surveil everyone. And what he found is that they were studying, how do we use the internet to divide people? And so we know that right now the Pentagon is investing and working with universities in an AI deepfake race. They're trying to create the best technology to create profiles online that would be indistinguishable from people. So it's like, why are our high levels of power literally manipulating what we see online? And so going down that rabbit hole, you realize that a lot of the division and the animosity online and just the surfaceness has been manufactured. The algorithms prioritize sensational content and dramatic content because it means more clicks and views.
Right. That to me makes sense. That's just marketing. Like, that's been happening for media since media. Like, it's as simple as the right thumbnail on YouTube to 200 years ago. Oh, what's the cover we should have on this book? Should we use yellow for the title because it's going to get people's attention more, or to make it more contemporary, magazine covers, Us Weekly, or, whatever we would see back when magazines were popular. I mean, they're going to put out there what's going to get people purchasing and in the case of today, clicking. Why was truth about the origin of COVID censored?
Well, first of all, number one is this virus wreaked havoc on society. It led to the greatest wealth transfer in history, and it like destroyed local economies and local businesses, along with all the other myriad of issues. And
So
so,
it was the cover, their asses.
well, imagine if you were responsible for unleashing
Right.
a virus that created so much collective harm. So
Right.
that's number one. But number two is you really have to understand that the military, since at least 9/11, but before it, was very interested in biowarfare research, biotechnology.
Okay.
And so a lot of these research, a lot of these projects were happening without any real oversight. And a lot of ethical considerations need to be put in place of why are we funding this type of research, knowing that actually labs across the world, especially Wuhan, there was a State Department cable before COVID hit saying, wow, Wuhan Institute of Virology they're not meeting their safety standards. And so if people realize like, wow, our taxpayer dollars are partly going to, well, definitely going to the military, and they're funding all of this gain of function research that, has huge ethical considerations we the people need to be talking about, and they're doing this covertly and secretly.
Why would they not want us to know about that?
Well, because we the people would be questioning, like, why are we doing this? And also, where is the accountability? So, like, if you contributed to research that created so much harm, so many people died, people's lives destroyed, greatest wealth transfer in history in the US, who's held accountable for that? And so,
So there was a cover your ass component, and there was the desire to keep the money flowing component.
well, yeah, keep the money flowing is like a given. But yeah, I think a lot of it was covering up like what they were actually doing.
Yep.
And because, the conspiracy part is like, why are they doing this? And so if you look at the history of biowarfare research in the US, it's very dark. It goes back to Operation Paperclip, which was kind of at the origins of how the CIA started, where we employed thousands of Nazis.
So evade responsibility, keep the money flowing. So money and power. We want a stronger military. We want to learn how these weapons work so that we can use them or threaten countries with them or whatever. We want these powerful weapons in our hands.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. Well, and what's interesting is that like we're working with China, right? So there's also that like what is really happening on a global level is very different than the narratives, these simple things of like, oh yeah, Russia's the enemy, China's the enemy. When you think about the elites, these issues between countries is not what we think they are. They're not so cut and dry. And in fact, elites all over the world work with each other. So the COVID thing, the motives aren't really clear yet because there really is considerable allegations that the whole COVID pandemic was really a test to see how we, the people, would respond to this. So on a basic level, it's like disaster capitalism. Like when something happens, elite corporate interests try to exploit it as much as possible so that they can gain money. But the deeper conspiracy as well is like, well, why would they do this? Because let's look at the outcomes where the level of censorship, just like I think 9/11 is a great example. So 9/11 created a perpetual surveillance state where a lot of our civil liberties got eroded. And and then like millions of people dying as a result of these 9/11 wars. And so you think, oh, wow, this is such a failure. Look how horrible it is for society. But then you look at the portfolios of the defense contractor stocks and you realize, no, this was a great success to people. So you got to wonder why and how, like, why would they allow a big virus to infect our whole society and cover it up and not take that responsibility? So I feel like we can go down this rabbit hole and it deserves its own podcast. Because it's a very complex topic.
I'm actually not that interested in the rabbit hole. I'm interested in just the clear motive here. So like they didn't want to get in trouble for the lab leak, or they one of the research money to continue flowing. So there's money as the motive, or it's darker and you're like, well, they actually wanted to unleash a virus to, I don't know, some sort of wealth transfer or some sort of controlling mechanism of the population or something like that. Or Pfizer wanted it out there so that they could sell more vaccines or whatever, right? So there's some sort of motive that, and the same with 9/11. Like, why did they want to surveil everyone, or why did they want the Patriot Act to go through? Well, because there were stocks to go up, defense stocks. They want to go to war because there's a lot of money in that, and maybe the ally in Israel wanted them to have a reason to go there and make it safer for their country or something like that. And follow me here. Another question is, why would they suppress the Hunter laptop story right before the election? And, the real simple answer is, well, so the people they want to have get in office would get in office. And so, okay, the picture I'm trying to paint here is there are so many like monster levers at play, whether it's a U.S. military, whether it's a government contract, whether it's the power of having the presidency. And all of this is pointing to or enabled by the fact that there are such huge systems out there, right? It's like when the Catholic Church owned Europe or ran Europe, there was that much more at stake for perhaps who was Pope or who was at the senior level of the Vatican. But with more decentralization of church, suddenly it's not it's still super powerful, but it's not the same as it once was. So this is about, do we want to see less corrupt people? Yeah. Do we want to see justice, less injustice for people who get away with stuff because they're too powerful? Yes. But I'm of the belief now that rather than worrying about turning down all these dials, I'd rather shrink the dial. Does that make sense? It's like, I don't know if we're ever because even if we're talking about the school board, there's still cover-ups. Like, hey, this one teacher, they brought a gun to school. Like, that's messed up. And by the letter of the law, that teacher should be out of here. But we really like this teacher. He's a gym teacher. And he was just going to go hunting with his pals after school. And did he bring a gun on school property? Yeah. Did he ignore the signs on the school that said a gun-free zone? Yeah. But we're not going to let anyone know about this. We're just going to brush them, So even at the point I'm making is that even at the level of a school, there's going to be corruption, right? That's just endemic. And I don't think that's ever going to go away. So what I favor, so I'm just pointing this back to the idea of decentralization. And maybe it's a both and thing. Like, hey, why don't we work on having on being less corrupt people, and let's break up the power structure a little bit so that there aren't such enticing positions that are super powerful, right? It's the Lord of the Rings. It's the one ring to rule them all.
Yeah, the centralization of power is a big part of this.
Yes. So like all of the incentive that I was asking you about, whether it's COVID, whether it's Patriot Act, whether it's hiding Hunter's laptop story, all of it had such incentive to be deceptive, be corrupt, to cause chaos amongst the Americans by pitting them against one another. All of that was incentivized because there was so much to gain, because there's so much power and money to gain.
Yeah.
And my thing is, well, if there wasn't that pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, then they wouldn't cause such harm in their pursuit of that pot of gold, right? Now, there's still going to be little pots of gold. You want to be the school board chair, you want to be the mayor of your town, whatever. But it's because there's such huge pots of gold, you get the most ruthless, the most heartless. Like what you just said earlier about agent provocateurs. like, yeah, let's throw a little fire on, or let's throw a little gas on this fire. Let's throw a few FBI agents in there to kind of, yeah, let's do that. You should storm the Capitol. Yeah, you should throw some rocks at the police officer. Yeah.
Right.
People die because of that. People's lives die. People's lives end. People's lives are ruined. Businesses, just normal mom and pop businesses, were burned to the ground.
Yeah.
Okay? Homes were burned to the ground. And there were people who died. One guy got burned alive, I think, in the Auto Valley, by that precinct there in Minneapolis. And so I just look at that at night. I don't know how. This is where I get cynical. And maybe we should end then on the things you said one can do to keep the love strong, despite the wisdom or the knowledge one gains of the darker side of humanity. I don't understand that evil. When I had the police officer on our blockchain organizations podcast, and he was talking about these scam organizations that will call an old person, get them to believe that, scare them into thinking that they have to deposit some money into this account, and then they do it, and then they lose it. Like, I don't know how they sleep at night. I don't understand this evil. I would like to see the incentive for it decrease at the government level. So that's why I'm really a big fan of the whole decentralization thing, because I don't know if we'll ever change human nature, but at least we can reduce those pots of gold by having these alternative systems, whether it's an alternative monetary system in Bitcoin or whether it's these startup societies that I've been fond of, like Prospero down in Honduras. But why don't we end this conversation with what you? Yeah, well, you mentioned earlier the idea of like things you can do. Do you recall mentioning that? And then, but you said we'll get to that later. So now is later. Those
Well,
those those ways to like cultivate positivity and love in the
there's
face
so
of
many
darkness.
Yeah, there's so many ways. And gosh, I mean, like, I could literally list like 10 very important ways, but right here, right now, what's emerging for me is what's social, and my response will kind of integrate everything you just shared here too, I think. But it reminds me of a social psychologist, Jonathan Haidt, and he's incredible. I don't know if you follow his work. I love his work. He just wrote a book about the anxious generation to really understand what's happened to our youth. And so he talks about the three forces holding a healthy society together. So I think number one, in terms of how do we face all this, is we need a vision. We need a vision for a better society, because a clear, positive vision draws people in and it brings people together. So at any point we can ask ourselves, what do we want? And really build this quality. Like, for example, when you said, oh yeah, like a lot of people are having better conversations with their families, it's like, let's take an appreciative inquiry approach. What made that possible? What made that work? So let's build off of what's working, what's right, and what we're for, number one. So for Jonathan Haidt, it's these three forces that hold a healthy society. This is his vision, which I really love, because as we decentralize, and I totally agree with you, we need to decentralize. And Schumacher, the economist, he said, centralization of power is the greatest threat to society. So as we do that, I think what can really hold us together, because it's like, too much freedom or like too much leads to the risk of people not really accountable to each other. So I think less about restricting people's freedom is creating a system where we're accountable to each other, where we belong to each other. And that's actually what restorative justice was all about. The more you include people in a community and build a strong community, the less people want to harm and hurt each other. So back to what I was saying, the three forces holding a healthy society together is social capital. So the value, trust, and support we create with each other. That also, social capital is strong relationships, right? So social capital. Two is strong institutions. Institutions that that aren't rigged like they are now, right? Like rigged to like the war on drugs. If you want to really understand the war on drugs, you realize it's really something that targeted everyday people while they protected the activities of the rich and powerful. So we don't have systems right now that can hold powerful people accountable and that can truly represent the voices of the people and not be corrupted. Like the revolving door is very classic among many different industries, is like, oh, people in government work for industries. So we need strong institutions. So social capital, strong institutions, and shared stories. So stories that create a shared reality where we have common ground, stories that bring us together and create a narrative we can all stand for. So these three things are what Jonathan Haidt talks about, holding us together. So that's really important. I think this is something that I recently came across this and it's been very inspiring to me. But the two things I was going to share, and I'll keep this brief. First of all, back to the darkness. We know that we can't avoid it. We need to face it. But to face it doesn't just mean to be afraid of it. And that's kind of the shift for me, is like a lot of my struggle was being afraid of it. And so, but it feels very compelling to be afraid of it. And I think we all need to go through a process of feeling that fear. It's not bad to feel that. But as Gandhi says, to heal fear, we need to understand. So it's like, why does this evil exist? Why are people motivated to do this? And so it reminds me of the whole conversation about white supremacists. It's like, we look at a kid growing up in a white supremacist household and we feel really bad for the kid because you realize this kid is so vulnerable to whatever they grew up with and that they're going to act out in ways that they were taught. But then that person becomes an adult and we're like, oh, wow, this person is an inhumane, horrible person. When you realize that a lot of people who are exposed to those ideologies has lots of trauma. So to really understand why harm begets harm and violence begets violence is to really understand the role that collective trauma has played in our society and how when we experience trauma, it gives us two choices. We're going to be a victim or we're going to be a perpetrator. We're going to be strong. We're going to fight back and we're not going to be harmed again. So we have to be big. And so I really say this because it's really important to understand that a lot of the elites and the harmful acts of injustice that have happened have largely stemmed from a culture within the elite world of abuse and power seeking and ideologies and a level of consciousness that is a separation consciousness where we don't recognize our interconnectedness. And the Bush family was a classic example. There's an incredible book called The Bush Crime Dynasty, talking about the levels of abuse running through that family where people are taught that there's only two choices. You're either a victim or you're the bully. And so we have to understand human consciousness. And there's actually an amazing quote that I'd love to read that really hits that narrative home. I don't know if we have time for it, but
how long is it?
It's like a brief paragraph.
Well, read it. Yeah. If you have it handy. Yeah.
I do. I was having it handy while we were talking. It's a book called Trauma and Nonviolence, which again, I think this is very important to understand why there's darkness is to understand collective trauma. So it says there are people who believe, and this is by Aurora Levins Morales. She's a historian. There are people who believe this is human nature. It's not difficult to find a nearly endless supply of such historical repetitions. Emancipated slaves turned slaveholders, persecuted religious minorities from England, who then burned, hanged, and crushed heretics and witches, or newly independent colonies creating their own categories of the economically and culturally suppressed second class. I watched my relatives reenact the horrors of the Holocaust, insist they're fighting for their survival against ruthless conspirators, and they increasingly live militarized lives, believe they have no choices, and they become more and more like their wounds. What are we to do? As people committed to social change and to creating just and peaceful societies, we have a responsibility to understand how the unjust and violent societies we live in sustain and recreate themselves. how the son of a Polish Jewish refugee, Paul Wolfowitz, can become the key strategist of world conquest for the grandson of Prescott Bush, who laundered money for Tyson, Nazi Germany's most prominent steel manufacturer, who used Jewish slave labor in his operations. How the granddaughter of a sharecropper, Condoleezza Rice, growing up in a segregated Birmingham, hearing the church bomb explosion that killed her schoolmate, could advise the descendant of Virginia landlords, George W. Bush, on how to recolonize the Middle East. We've learned about the cycles of abuse within families, about the way a child who is beaten and abused can become an adult who feels like a victim while acting like a perpetrator. But as activists, we've failed to see the immense implications of this knowledge. Over and over, I see movements of liberation get stuck at the same place. The moment when we other the agents of our oppression without trying to understand why they are as they are and how we can prevent more people being that way in the future. Last line. If we even begin to ask those questions, we are rapidly drawn to the places where we ourselves have been most deeply wounded. And the exact place where it is most difficult to understand how anyone can do as our enemies have done and still be human is the place of greatest potential illumination. So, yeah, I say that quote because we can shift from being afraid of the darkness to understanding the darkness and how it really operates. And when you realize that this is a long-standing pattern of humanity, that this has been going on for a while, it no longer feels like this random, chaotic, horrible, it's just a pattern. And so we as humans need to learn how to dance with this paradox of life, which is the light and the dark. And so seeking that higher perspective has really helped. But the last thing I'll say is opening up to the greater good and what's possible. So opening up to solutions for sure, because we really have all the solutions we need to solve some of our biggest problems. And we have an inspiration center that has thousands of inspiring examples of that, real world examples.
Who's we? Want to know?
WantToKnow.info.
Yeah.
But also we need to seek narratives that remind us of who we really are beyond politics, as you said, right? Like, hey, we want a garden. We're literally human beings. But a lot of that for me has been diving into the world of UFOs, near-death experiences, what happens after life, fascinating stories of people that have been declared clinically dead, and they come back to life with a transformative point of view and experiences that defy conventional understanding of reality. And so these are windows into who we really are. And I think grounding ourselves in that knowing versus grounding ourselves in problems and politics is a great foundation for us that reminds us always that it's never always light, but it's never always dark. And we can learn to be and find balance with all of that. And notice when we get stuck in any way that we find other ways of making sense of the world that actually fill us up with empowerment and curiosity rather than fear. So anything that makes us more afraid and angry, I question. So yeah, that would be
That's it.
anything that makes me turn against someone else.
One
of my favorite lines is no enemy. There is no enemy.
Wow. Oh, that is wonderful. Thank you so much for all of that. And I love how it seems perhaps maybe the third leg of your stool is the supernatural then. And maybe others would find theirs to be religion or spirituality, but your work with UFOs, which I intended to get to, but next time,
I know.
that or the afterlife, that to me screams life is bigger than what we know here on Earth. So even though we
are as humans are much more powerful.
That broadens perspective a lot, and it helps us lighten up about the corruption or the controversies here on Earth.
Yeah.
Wow. Oh, but thanks so much just in addressing those controversies and how to address it with love. I love that quote by Morales and all the other wisdom you shared here with me and with all listeners here. So thanks so much for your time, Amber. This has been wonderful.
Thank you so much for listening and going with me in these emerging, challenging, complex topics.
Thank you for leading the way.